Hello and welcome to Nocab Game Design.
Let me catch you up on the current situation.
In this episode, we take a look at the Valkyria Chronicles Chapter 7 combat operation titled Desert Duel with Maximillian. As the name implies, Squad 7 is squaring off against the enemy commander, Maximillian himself. This is a boss fight, the second of the game. The previous boss fight encounter was in Episode 5. I recommend you check it out. But at the time, I didn't talk about the boss fight itself. In this episode, I'm going to fix that. Today, I want to break down the anatomy of the classic video game boss fight. The most important element of a boss encounter is that it needs to stand out amongst the other encounters so far. Now, there are a lot of ways to achieve this, but here, the developers decided to go with three main techniques. The boss is invulnerable, the boss can deal extreme damage to the player, and this encounter generally features unique gameplay. Now, I'll talk about these three elements in due time, but before I do, I want to mention that these are not the only techniques for making a good boss encounter. They're just the ones the devs chose to use for this encounter. Now, these three techniques in particular are classics. They're probably the three most common elements of boss fights generally, and for good reasons. They are extremely effective at achieving the original design goal of the classic boss fight. It needs to stand out. Okay, let's start with invulnerability. Most units in this game, and most games generally speaking, take damage when hit. Even if you shoot them in the foot, their health bar will go down. Some units take more damage in a critical spot, a headshot, or the radiators on the tanks, for example. And at this point in the game, the player should be familiar with the two damage types, anti-personnel and anti-armor. Basically, using a rifle against a tank is just not going to work. But this boss takes it a step further. Nothing can damage it. The Edelweiss is powerless, the anti-tank lancers just bounce right off. The game even explicitly tells a player, this tank is unkillable.
Holy. With armor like that, I don't figure my anti-tank lance will do much good.
It's clear this enemy large tank, which is called the Batimus, is invulnerable and cannot be killed. Yet.
Let's watch and wait for now. It has to have some kind of weak point.
But before we get there, let's talk about why. Why put an unkillable unit in a game about killing enemy units? Well, number one, it makes the encounter stand out. Almost everything in this game so far has been solved with more guns. But not this. So of course it's going to stand out. The familiar gameplay loop has been disrupted. The tools the player have won't work here. Next, this is a boss encounter. Players understand this is supposed to be harder than normal. They're expecting it to be a challenge spike. Easy doesn't always mean fun, especially for boss encounters. Making the boss invulnerable is a simple way to make the level harder, and a sudden spike in game difficulty will make it stand out among the previous levels. But a sudden difficulty spike is risky. A player could get frustrated with it, and that's kind of the point. An unkillable boss will create an outsized emotional impact on a player. The idea is that, hopefully, the frustration will turn to pride once they win. Desperation to triumph. This emotional reaction is valuable for many reasons. But I won't get sidetracked, and I will simply say that it works to make the encounter memorable and stand out in a player's memories. The Unkillable Boss also gives the developers a chance to tell a story or author a more potent experience. In this encounter, there's a lot of dialogue between turns, or scripted events that happen as the Batimus progresses through the level. This gives the developers breathing room to add unique mechanics, which I'll talk about later in the video, but some of these mechanics are only possible if the boss is unkillable. And finally, there's a historical precedent for unkillable bosses. Many games feature invulnerable bosses. It's a common trope, so most players will understand that there's a trick or event that will expose a weak point on the boss. Studying the design techniques used in other games will help you identify what works and what doesn't. Understanding the history of bosses in game design is important if you want to make good games, and doing a deep study of a topic like this is a great way to improve your game design skills. If you want to learn more about game design but don't have the time to study it, consider subscribing and I'll do the studying for you. Leave a comment or a like as well. That will also help in the studying process, somehow. But in summary, why put an unkillable boss fight in a game? Well, because it's a proven technique to make the encounter stand out. Now, let's talk about some issues with invulnerable units and how to design healthy encounters that include them. The biggest issue is perhaps the most obvious. It's not fair. It's frustrating. By design, the player feels powerless, which is not fun. If a player doesn't see themselves making progress, then they're just going to lose patience and give up quickly. So how can a developer design an encounter that makes a player feel like they're making progress against an unkillable enemy? The developers of Valkyria Chronicles use two main techniques. 1. Include some actual killable enemies, and 2. Make the encounter dynamic. Something needs to change or progress in a predictable way. The first technique of adding other enemies for the player to play with is fairly simple to do, from a design standpoint. It distracts the player from the frustration of Invulnerable Boss, and it also shows the player they are making meaningful, measurable progress. This encounter features two types of killable enemies. The ground units, which a player is used to by now, are off on the side away from the boss, pulling the player's attention and resources this way. And second, these turrets, small little things that are attached to the boss itself. Perhaps if the player destroys all these turrets, then a weakness will appear. This is an effective technique to keep a player engaged, but it's also very challenging for them to deal with. Adding more enemies to a level that already has an unkillable unit will only make the level harder. So the other design technique used here is to make the encounter dynamic. The Batimus moves every turn. The situation changes. This way, the player never feels stuck. Perhaps a change in the environment will expose a weakness, and that's what happens in this level. As the Batimus advances, the player interacts with the level architecture, blocks its path, and uses the opportunity to deal damage to the large tank. Making the level dynamic in this way is good for a few reasons. Dynamic environments are typically unique, and I'll talk about that near the end of the video, but more relevant now, it can keep a player motivated without increasing the challenge much. In a tactics and strategy game like Valkyria Chronicles, knowing exactly what an enemy is going to do is invaluable to a player. It allows them to set up an ambush or pull units out of danger. This predictability reduces the challenge of the level, but only for players who are good at strategic thinking, which at this point most players probably should be. The last point about dynamic environments is that they can also add a dramatic punch to a level. This is effectively a race. Stop the tank before it destroys Squad 7's main base. It's a stressful situation. On one hand, changing level environments are predictable, which a player can use to their advantage, but it's not necessarily controllable. Depending on how a designer sets up the encounter, the player could be looking forward to or dreading the dynamic element of the encounter. In other words, you can tighten the screws or loosen them. Here, the Valkyria Chronicles devs tighten the screws, and boy do they get tight. Making the boss unkillable is only one technique for designing memorable encounters. The next common design technique is to give the boss power overwhelming. The Batimus features two main cannons, one pointing forward and one pointing back. Any unit that ends their turn in the area will be obliterated. If you attempt to approach from the side, the machine guns are waiting for you. This thing is absolutely bristling with machine guns. They'll shoot at you on your turn, they'll shoot at you on their turn. They are always shooting you, and they hurt a lot. Again, I'll ask why. The boss is already unkillable. Isn't that enough? Why also load it up with extreme firepower? And again, the answer is because it's memorable. A lot of the points I made earlier, the challenge spike, the emotional impact, the historical precedents, are also true here too. I won't dwell on them again, this video is already getting kinda long, but there is a new idea I want to discuss. If the boss was only invulnerable, then the gameplay would be very offensive oriented. The player would throw everything they've got at the enemy and would never be punished. If the boss was only powerful, the gameplay would be very defensive from the player's perspective. The player would have to watch their step and focus mostly on finding cover and hiding. But if a designer wants to encourage more balanced gameplay, then the enemy needs to have a balance between offensive and defensive skills. This is true for any encounter, not just boss encounters, but boss encounters are a special case because they are usually extreme. So why give an unkillable boss overwhelming power? Because it keeps the gameplay balanced. Not balanced between the player and the enemy, but balanced between the style of gameplay that is being encouraged. Now, let's talk about how to design a fun encounter that features an unkillable, overpowered enemy boss unit, and the ideas are similar to the ideas from before. Earlier, I said the boss has high defenses, so give the player something they can focus their own offensive abilities on. Here, I'm saying the boss has high offensive abilities, so give the player something they can focus their own defensive skills on. notice the two main tank cannons don't actually have total battlefield coverage, and honestly, units probably shouldn't be directly in front of or behind the Batimus anyways, so restricting that space from the player is not a big issue. More importantly, this level gives the player a really good defensive position. Lots of trenches in convenient places, walls that are perfectly placed to block the line of sight from the turrets, a natural high ground, and reinforcement bases are nearby. The Batimus circles around these defensive structures, so it's easy for a player to reposition their units. In short, if the boss is an unstoppable juggernaut, then give the player immovable defenses. Now, I'm not saying to make the player units unkillable as well. I'm just saying that the battlefield should be set up to make it easy for a player to be defensive. So far, most of the advice that I've given can be applied to any old unit. The developers could have taken a regular grunt unit, made it invulnerable, given it a massive cannon, and called it a boss fight, and some games do that. Actually, the third combat operation of this game is similar to that. I'm sure you all remember that video fondly, but if you don't, there's a link in the top right. And in summary, the player only had a few scout units and were pitted against a light tank. Effectively, an invulnerable boss with overwhelming firepower, but it was just an average run-of-the-mill tank. That works for some boss encounters, but if your goal is to make the encounter stand out, you should not do that. I doubt many of you even remember that video. Heck, I even made 3 videos about that one level. But that's a testament to how poorly the encounter stands out in player memories. So to ensure that the level is memorable, the developers also make it unique. The Batimus is a unique unit and will not make another appearance in this game, or any of the other Valkyria Chronicle games. The way the player deals damage is unique. They have to interact with the environment, wait for the tank to fire, which exposes its weak point. Then the next turn, the player has to climb onto the tank itself and throw a well-placed grenade into the exhaust ports. And they have to do this 3 times. 3 is a classic number in video games for things like this. From a storytelling perspective, there are a lot of unique elements that were introduced. Spoilers, but this is a 14-year-old game. Sorry, not sorry. This is the first time the player fights the enemy commander, Maximillian, and also the first time the player fights his secret weapon, Selvaria, who is revealed to be a Valkyrie. And she is also invulnerable, and also has overwhelming power. 2 boss units in one level, that is also unique. And let me tell you, the second boss unit has a major emotional impact. When you're so close to beating the level, the developers throw you a curveball, and suddenly it gets exciting again. If you want to make a boss level stand out, then make it unique in as many ways as you can. The boss unit is unique, the mission profile is unique, the level offers unique affordances with the destructible environment, the boss has a unique weakness, the story introduces a few major plot points. Even years later, I still remember the first time I played this level. Some of the other levels have blurred with time, but this one stands out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something. Let me know what you think of this episode. It's a little bit longer than some of my other recent videos. I've been playing around with my script writing process, so what do you think? Would you prefer shorter 5 to 10 minute videos answering specific game design questions? Or perhaps the old Halo model of 15+ minute episodes where I talk about every aspect of a given level? Or maybe a little bit of both. Let me know what you think. In the next episode, Alicia and Welkin go on a not-so-romantic late-night walk in the woods. I'll see you there.
My legs aren't